January 17, 1944. A pale sun struggles through low clouds over the dense jungles of New Guinea. The air hangs heavy with heat and the scent of wet earth. Japanese soldiers, weary from days of relentless marching through mud and tangled foliage, pause along a narrow, rutted trail. Their boots sink into the clay. Rifles are slung loosely over shoulders, faces streaked with sweat and grime. The usual tension lingers, eyes scanning for ambushes, hands twitching near bayonets, hearts pounding with exhaustion and discipline drilled into them from childhood. But something is different here. Ahead, small clusters of American soldiers stand, not advancing, not shouting orders, but offering water, blankets, and shaded rest areas. The Japanese soldiers halt, disbelief etched across their faces. Whispers ripple through the ranks. Could this be a trap? Or are the Americans truly allowing them to rest? The jungle hums with the sound of insects and distant artillery, a quiet counterpoint to the shock spreading through the exhausted troops. In that moment, everything they thought they knew about their enemy, the relentless, unyielding Americans, begins to shift. The scene fades into the broader context of the Pacific Campaign. By early 1944, the Pacific War had entered a crucial phase. Following the devastating battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Solomon Islands campaigns, the United States had gained momentum in what was once considered Japan's defensive perimeter. The Japanese Imperial Army, though still formidable, was increasingly stretched across distant islands, supply lines vulnerable, and morale fraying under constant bombardment and attritional losses. The Allies, having rebuilt their naval and air capabilities after Pearl Harbor, now leveraged superior logistics, intelligence, and mobility to challenge Japanese forces across the Pacific. New Guinea, a sprawling island of dense jungle, steep ridges, and treacherous rivers, had become a central battleground. Japanese troops had been sent to secure airfields and defend key coastal positions, while Allied forces sought to isolate strongholds and sever supply chains. The terrain itself was as formidable an enemy as the opposing army. Torrential rains turned trails into quagmires. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed more lives than direct combat. Troop movements were measured in miles, not kilometers, and each day tested the limits of discipline and endurance. Japanese doctrine emphasized relentless forward pressure, strict adherence to orders, and minimal concern for individual welfare. Rest, when allowed, was often brief and regimented, framed by the belief that any pause could invite disaster. Soldiers carried rations designed for efficiency, not comfort, and rest areas were sparse, often makeshift clearings with no shelter from sun, rain, or insects. Leadership enforced strict marching schedules, believing that any leniency would erode morale or discipline. Meanwhile, American strategy evolved around combined arms coordination. Infantry, supported by artillery, naval bombardment, and increasingly sophisticated air power, moved deliberately, but with attention to troop welfare. Commanders understood that exhausted soldiers performed poorly. Rotations, short rest periods, and medical support were part of a calculated approach to maintain fighting capability. This attention to basic needs, while tactically practical, was culturally unfamiliar to Japanese troops, who expected the enemy to embody the same relentless, uncompromising ethos. Intelligence reports had warned both sides of the psychological and logistical challenges ahead. Japanese scouts noted unusual restraint in American patrols, but patterns were difficult to interpret. For Japanese soldiers, encountering an enemy who paused, provided rest, or allowed temporary reprieve violated expectations learned from years of military indoctrination. Suspicion and caution were natural responses. The unfamiliar behavior sparked internal debate among officers and enlisted men alike. As American forces advanced through the rugged interior, they began implementing a deliberate system of short rest points along key trails. Soldiers were instructed to offer water, small food rations, and shade whenever enemy units were encountered in positions of surrender or temporary hold. These moments were intended to preserve manpower and minimize unnecessary confrontation, but they carried an unexpected psychological effect. The Japanese troops, conditioned to expect aggression and immediate engagement, were confronted with gestures of strategic humanity. In this environment of jungles, rivers, and high ridges, small encounters held disproportionate weight. The combination of physical exhaustion, isolation, and cultural conditioning heightened every response. When Japanese soldiers finally approached American positions that allowed brief rest, they were not merely pausing. They were witnessing a stark deviation from all precedent. This dissonance would become a defining moment, revealing as much about the differences in military culture as about battlefield tactics. The stage was set. Both sides were aware of the strategic objectives, yet the human element, fatigue, expectation, and perception, was poised to alter the immediate interaction. What followed would become emblematic of the subtle psychological warfare that underpinned larger campaigns, a moment when care for human endurance clashed with assumptions of relentless hostility. The focus now shifts to the immediate units involved and the personal and tactical expectations that framed this historic encounter. The Japanese units involved in this episode were primarily elements of the 18th Army, seasoned troops dispatched to defend New Guinea's northern approaches. Their journey from Rabaul had been grueling. Weeks of marching through mud-soaked trails, dodging Allied air raids, and enduring tropical diseases had left soldiers physically depleted and mentally strained. Supplies were irregular. Rations often consisted of dried rice or small fish, insufficient for sustained exertion. Commanders relied on strict discipline to maintain cohesion, knowing that even a minor lapse could leave a unit vulnerable to ambush or artillery fire. Opposing them were American forces under General Douglas MacArthur's command, specifically units of the 32nd Infantry Division and supporting engineers and medical teams. Unlike their adversaries, these soldiers benefited from superior supply lines, air support, and medical logistics. Water, shade, and short rest periods were deliberately built into the march, reflecting a pragmatic understanding of human limits. Even in hostile terrain, commanders prioritized the well-being of troops, recognizing that a rested soldier was exponentially more effective than one driven purely by exhaustion. Cultural differences further amplified the encounter. Japanese military doctrine emphasized self-sacrifice, perseverance through fatigue, and unwavering obedience. Soldiers were trained to consider surrender or delay as dishonorable. Any sign of leniency from the enemy could be perceived as weakness, or, conversely, as a tactical ploy demanding caution. American military culture, rooted in a combination of pragmatism and humane logistics, intentionally created moments where the enemy might be disoriented by unexpected actions. For the Japanese troops, encountering enemy soldiers who did not immediately engage, but instead allowed rest, was profoundly disorienting. The march itself, set against the backdrop of dense jungle and intermittent artillery fire, magnified the psychological effect. Soldiers moved in tight formations, eyes scanning for threats, ears straining for distant gunfire. The landscape offered few landmarks, and the constant threat of ambush meant that every pause was inherently dangerous. Yet, when they encountered Americans offering rest, blankets, and shade, the Japanese soldiers experienced a cognitive dissonance they had never been trained to navigate. Leadership played a critical role in this moment. Japanese officers struggled to interpret the Americans' intentions. Were these pauses strategic traps? Were the Americans conserving strength for a decisive attack? Meanwhile, American leaders had carefully calculated these encounters to reduce unnecessary casualties, maintain morale, and subtly unsettle enemy forces. Every gesture of care was deliberate. Water offered, a shade tarp erected, rations handed over, actions small in isolation but cumulatively profound in impact. This episode also reflects the broader logistical environment of the Pacific Campaign. The Allies had established forward supply depots and field hospitals in previously hostile areas, allowing rapid reinforcement and medical attention. These measures contrasted sharply with Japanese reliance on foraging and stretched supply lines. In effect, the Americans were demonstrating not just superior resources, but an operational philosophy that valued the human element. The Japanese soldiers, accustomed to endurance through suffering, now faced evidence that their assumptions about the enemy were incomplete. As the Japanese troops paused along narrow jungle trails, their movements slowed, eyes wary yet incredulous. Conversations among small groups betrayed their surprise. Whispers of disbelief, questioning the motives behind the unexpected respite. For many, it was the first time they had observed such behavior from American soldiers, and the effect rippled through the ranks. Fatigue, expectation, and culture collided in a single, tangible moment, one that would echo in reports and memoirs long after the battle. This unusual interaction, while minor in scale, foreshadowed the profound psychological influence that American operational practices would exert throughout the campaign. It was a collision not of weapons alone, but of assumptions, endurance, and perception, a subtle yet decisive battlefield advantage. The moment now approaches its full exploration, how individual perspectives, tactical reasoning, and leadership decisions converged to create the shock experienced by Japanese soldiers. 1. Human experience for the Japanese soldiers, the experience was unprecedented. Weeks of constant marching, hunger, and tropical disease had eroded both body and mind. Each pause offered by the Americans was a moment of disbelief. Water, food, and even brief shade were not just logistical relief. They represented a psychological anomaly. Many soldiers struggled to reconcile their training, which demanded perseverance without complaint, with the reality before them. Faces streaked with mud, hands blistered from bamboo and pack straps. They hesitated, unsure whether to trust the unexpected generosity. Some dared to sit, exhausted limbs sinking into the damp earth, feeling a sense of relief they had not allowed themselves to imagine for days. For these soldiers, the pause was not merely physical. It challenged their understanding of honor, discipline, and the nature of the enemy. 2. Tactical reasoning from the American perspective, the decision to allow Japanese soldiers rest was calculated. Commanders understood the value of conserving energy, both for their own troops and for enemy forces. By offering minimal sustenance and shade, they reduced immediate confrontation risks while subtly disrupting the psychological rhythm of the Japanese advance. It was a method of controlled engagement, using humanitarian gestures as tactical instruments. The Americans recognized that exhaustion compromised coordination and combat effectiveness. A rested enemy, paradoxically, could sometimes be easier to monitor and predict than one driven to desperation. Every small gesture, handing over water, allowing a brief respite, functioned as a tactical lever, influencing enemy behavior without firing a shot. 3. Technological edge. The impact of logistics technology cannot be understated. American supply lines, vehicles, and portable medical kits enabled these rest points. Water purification tools, collapsible stretchers, and field rations allowed sustained operations in dense jungles. In contrast, Japanese units relied heavily on foraging and manually carried supplies, often insufficient for sustained campaigns. This disparity in resources became immediately apparent during encounters. Japanese soldiers observed Americans effortlessly distributing supplies while maintaining combat readiness, a tangible demonstration of operational superiority. Beyond mere comfort, technology shaped the psychological battlefield. Soldiers recognized, even subconsciously, that the enemy's endurance was underpinned by systems far more sophisticated than their own. 4. Leadership decisions. Leadership decisions on both sides magnified the encounter's impact. Japanese officers, adhering to rigid doctrine, struggled with ambiguity. Pauses and aid from the Americans violated expected behavior, forcing leaders to balance caution with the need to maintain morale and order. Any misstep could provoke panic or unauthorized retreat. Conversely, American officers carefully orchestrated each interaction. Orders emphasized restraint, observation, and controlled generosity. The decision to allow rest was deliberate. It demonstrated confidence, disrupted enemy expectations, and projected moral authority. Commanders on both sides influenced the flow of this seemingly minor event, illustrating how leadership extended beyond battlefield maneuvers into psychological strategy. 5. Enemy perspective from the Japanese point of view. The encounter challenged preconceptions. Soldiers had been taught to expect relentless aggression from Americans. The respite was confusing and in some cases disconcerting. Some Japanese troops suspected traps, fearing that rest was a prelude to ambush. Others experienced cognitive dissonance. They could not reconcile American attentiveness to soldier welfare with their understanding of enemy behavior. This confusion created hesitation, subtle shifts in formation, and reduced aggressiveness. Observing the enemy acting contrary to expectation became, in itself, a tactical advantage for the Americans. Psychological disruption, even in moments of inaction, could influence the outcome of future engagements. 6. Moral and cultural contrast. Finally, the encounter highlighted a stark moral and cultural divergence. Japanese soldiers operated under strict codes of sacrifice and endurance, valuing relentless pursuit of objectives above comfort or self-preservation. Americans, while equally disciplined, integrated welfare and sustainability into operational planning. By allowing the Japanese soldiers to rest, the Americans were demonstrating a philosophy that combined tactical pragmatism with a recognition of human limits. The encounter thus transcended immediate military considerations, creating a subtle ethical contrast that Japanese troops could not ignore. Their shock was not only tactical but cultural, revealing differences in values that extended beyond the battlefield. These angles, individually and collectively, reveal how a small moment of rest could ripple through the minds and strategies of soldiers. The Japanese shock was rooted not in weaponry or sheer numbers, but in the psychological and operational contrast between two armies, one driven by endurance and rigid hierarchy, the other by calculated pragmatism and the use of humanity as a strategic tool. The next section will continue exploring these perspectives, focusing on the cumulative effect of these angles and how they intensified the Japanese reaction, setting the stage for the decisive turning point. 7. Psychological impact. The cumulative effect of the Americans' deliberate restraint and attention to human needs weighed heavily on Japanese soldiers. Each pause, each offered ration, undermined expectations built over years of military indoctrination. Exhausted bodies felt relief, but the mind struggled to interpret it. Hesitation spread among small units. Movement slowed, eyes darted warily, and whispered uncertainty threaded through the ranks. Officers attempted to maintain order, but even experienced leaders recognized the novelty of the situation. This subtle psychological disruption created an operational advantage for the Americans, an enemy physically present but mentally unsettled, unsure whether to engage, retreat, or merely observe. 8. Tactical ripple effects beyond immediate morale. The rest periods had tangible tactical consequences. Soldiers who were allowed to pause did not immediately seek combat, reducing skirmishes and allowing American forces to reposition strategically. Commanders could predict enemy hesitation, establish ambush points, or redirect resources without heavy engagement. Small acts of rest and provision thus multiplied in effect, demonstrating how operational psychology could shape battlefield outcomes. For Japanese troops, the encounter disrupted the rigid tempo of their advance, delaying movements and subtly fracturing unit cohesion. 9. Logistical superiority. This event also showcased the broader advantages of American logistical planning. Field hospitals, supply lines, and mobile ration units allowed sustained operations in environments that would have exhausted other armies. Japanese soldiers observed that their adversaries could maintain strength and readiness while simultaneously offering respite to enemy troops. This disparity was not lost on them. It underscored an enduring principle of modern warfare. Superior logistics equate to strategic superiority. The rest periods were a microcosm of this advantage, a quiet demonstration of organizational depth that went far beyond the immediate moment. 10. Leadership contrast. American leadership emphasized adaptability and calculated risk. By permitting rest, commanders projected both confidence and strategic foresight. Japanese officers, in contrast, faced the dual challenge of maintaining discipline while interpreting unfamiliar enemy behavior. For soldiers accustomed to rigid orders, this deviation in expected combat conduct generated tension and doubt. Leadership styles, therefore, directly shaped the battlefield experience. The Americans' emphasis on human endurance and observation not only optimized their own performance, but leveraged the enemy's cultural and operational assumptions as an indirect weapon. 11. Cultural resonance. At the heart of the shock lay cultural dissonance. Japanese military doctrine valorized sacrifice, endurance, and immediate action. American soldiers demonstrated care and pragmatism, bridging operational necessity with humane consideration. For Japanese troops, these gestures were foreign, almost inconceivable. The encounter became a moral mirror, a reflection of an opposing culture that valued not just victory, but the preservation of human life and cohesion. This realization, subtle yet profound, challenged Japanese soldiers' assumptions about the enemy, leaving an enduring impression that would color their perception of American operations throughout the campaign. 12. Long-term morale effects. The encounter's significance extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese memoirs and post-war accounts frequently referenced moments of unexpected American restraint as psychologically disruptive. Soldiers recalled how such interactions instilled hesitation, prompted questions of strategy and intent, and contributed to cumulative fatigue of morale over time. Conversely, American units recognized the utility of these measures. Strategic restraint could yield both operational advantages and long-term psychological influence, shaping the enemy's perception without direct combat. The rest periods thus acted as a quiet but persistent instrument of warfare, influencing both the human and operational dimensions of the campaign. Together, these angles demonstrate the multidimensional nature of the encounter. It was not a single tactical maneuver, nor a brief cultural exchange. It was a convergence of human, technological, logistical, and ethical factors. The Japanese shock stemmed from the intersection of these elements. An adversary capable of sustained operations while exercising deliberate restraint, challenging expectations, and reshaping perceptions. The stage is now set for the pivotal moment, the climax, when the full impact of this encounter crystallizes, decisively shaping the outcome of the engagement and revealing the profound effect of this seemingly small act of American operational humanity. February 2nd, 1944. The dense jungle of New Guinea presses down like a living weight, humid and suffocating. Japanese troops of the 18th Army, exhausted from days of relentless marching through mud-choked trails, pause at the edge of a shallow clearing. Every muscle aches. Every breath carries the scent of sweat and earth. The sun, diffused through the thick canopy, glints off rifles and helmets, highlighting the grime and fatigue etched into the soldiers' faces. For these troops, battle is not just a question of tactics, but survival, a continuous struggle against both the enemy and the unforgiving environment. Ahead, American forces lie in wait, but not in the manner the Japanese anticipate. There is no sudden ambush, no immediate volley of gunfire. Instead, small groups of American soldiers move calmly, setting up temporary shade with tarps, distributing water from canisters, and handing out supplemental rations. Medics tend to the lightly wounded and assist those suffering from heat exhaustion. The air hums with insect noise, punctuated only by distant artillery and the occasional clink of canteens. Japanese soldiers stop in disbelief. Some lower their weapons slightly, a reflexive gesture of caution mixed with fatigue. Whispers pass through the ranks. Is this a trap? Why are they not attacking? Officers bark orders to maintain formation, but the rhythm of strict obedience falters. Their training dictates immediate aggression, yet the Americans' restraint creates hesitation. It is a rare, disorienting moment, one in which expectation collides with reality. Lieutenant Colonel Shigeru Tanaka, commanding one Japanese company, surveys the scene. His eyes narrow, uncertainty flickering across his face. The men under his command are visibly struggling, their endurance tested to the limit. Yet the Americans' approach is methodical, deliberate, and, above all, non-hostile. For Tanaka, the moment embodies a contradiction, an enemy capable of immense power, yet exercising calculated restraint, offering basic human consideration in the midst of war. This paradox unsettles him more than any barrage of bullets could. For the Americans, the pause is strategic brilliance in subtle form. By permitting rest, they allow the Japanese soldiers' exhaustion to manifest not through immediate collapse, but through hesitation and cognitive overload. Troops who would normally continue marching, obey orders, and engage without question are now forced to confront uncertainty. It is a tactical leverage of psychology rather than firepower, an orchestration of restraint that magnifies the operational advantage. As Japanese soldiers tentatively accept water or shade, the psychological effect spreads. Platoons slow their advance, scanning for hidden threats that never come. The predictable tempo of their march fractures. Some men sink to the damp earth, unable to believe the enemy's actions. Officers struggle to maintain order while suppressing their own doubts about the Americans' intentions. The jungle, once merely a physical obstacle, becomes a stage for the collision of discipline and disbelief. By mid-morning, the impact is evident. Small skirmishes that might have erupted are avoided. Japanese units proceed cautiously, never fully confident that the respite is genuine. Every pause creates ripples of confusion, minor disruptions that cumulatively delay their advance. The Americans, meanwhile, maintain vigilance, observing the enemy's hesitation, prepared to respond if the situation escalates. Their decision to allow rest, rather than engage immediately, has transformed a simple tactical maneuver into a turning point. This moment, subtle yet decisive, demonstrates the convergence of human endurance, cultural assumptions, and operational planning. For the Japanese soldiers, it is a shock to their expectations, a fracture in the mental framework that guides their behavior. For the Americans, it is a quiet assertion of control, an exercise of influence that requires no gunfire to achieve effect. The pause becomes a pivot, a fulcrum upon which the immediate psychological battlefield teeters. The tension in the clearing is almost tangible. Each step, each movement, carries the weight of uncertainty. The Japanese soldier's shock is no longer a simple reaction. It is a state that reshapes their decisions, their timing, and their perception of the enemy. In that brief span, a single act of strategic humanity wields influence equivalent to artillery, forcing the opponent to confront not just physical barriers, but the unexpected logic of their adversary's choices. The unfolding hesitation foreshadows the decisive moments to come, when American strategy and Japanese perception will collide fully, determining the immediate outcome of the engagement and leaving a lasting imprint on both sides. As the day wore on, the significance of the Americans' decision became increasingly clear. Japanese troops, still weary from the previous day's grueling march, remained paused in the clearing. The sunlight filtered weakly through the dense jungle canopy, casting mottled shadows over rifles, backpacks, and the mud-slicked ground. Each man's body protested against fatigue, yet their minds wrestled with the unfamiliar scenario, an enemy that allowed rest, distributed water, and offered shade without aggression. For Colonel Tanaka, the realization weighed heavily. Orders and doctrine had long dictated that the enemy would exploit any pause, that hesitation signaled vulnerability to be exploited. Yet here, the Americans had created a controlled environment where the Japanese soldiers could regain strength, but only at the cost of their own psychological certainty. The officers attempted to maintain cohesion, but tension simmered under the surface. Men whispered to one another, their fatigue amplified by the internal conflict between instinctive caution and the physical relief offered. American soldiers moved calmly among the Japanese ranks, monitoring reactions and maintaining disciplined vigilance. The engineers who had set up improvised shade structures and distributed water rations did so with methodical precision. Medics tended to minor injuries and heat exhaustion, reinforcing the appearance of order and calm. Every gesture, though small, reinforced the perception of deliberate competence. It was a tactical demonstration of restraint that had immediate and lasting consequences. By mid-afternoon, subtle tactical advantages had begun to emerge. Japanese units, now unnerved by the dissonance between expectation and reality, slowed their advance. Formations became staggered. Command was occasionally interrupted by confusion over whether the pause was genuine or a prelude to attack. Skirmishes that might otherwise have occurred were postponed or avoided entirely, allowing American forces to consolidate positions, strengthen defensive lines, and observe enemy movements with greater clarity. The physical act of rest had translated directly into a psychological and operational edge. In this delicate balance, every small incident carried weight. A soldier sitting under a tarpaulin, sipping water, reflected a moment of human vulnerability that disrupted the rigid march tempo. Another, lowering his rifle briefly to accept rations, introduced hesitation that radiated outward through the platoon. The Americans had transformed ordinary logistical support into an instrument of influence, subtly bending the battlefield to their advantage without firing a single shot. The jungle itself amplified the effect. Thick foliage limited visibility, so hesitation created uncertainty about enemy numbers and positions. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to expect constant aggression, found their instincts unreliable. Each pause demanded heightened alertness, yet the Americans' calm demeanor suggested no immediate threat. Conflicting signals, the absence of attack, the presence of sustenance, created an internal tension that was almost unbearable after days of continuous exertion. By late afternoon, the impact was undeniable. Japanese units had lost momentum, delayed by hours simply due to the psychological weight of the Americans' restraint. Commanders recorded in field reports that the unexpected pause had disrupted unit cohesion, slowed movements, and forced constant reassessment of enemy intent. What began as a minor logistical accommodation had evolved into a decisive turning point, demonstrating that operational success depended not solely on firepower, but also on the manipulation of expectation, perception, and endurance. For the Americans, the results validated a doctrine that balanced tactical aggression with humane strategy. Soldiers understood that allowing a brief respite did not weaken their position, it enhanced it. They maintained readiness, disciplined control, and situational awareness while simultaneously shaping enemy behavior. The encounter exemplified an approach where empathy and efficiency converged, creating both immediate and long-term advantages. As the sun began to sink behind the jungle canopy, casting long shadows across the trail, Japanese troops reluctantly resumed their march. Fatigue remained, but now it was compounded by uncertainty. Trust and instincts had been undermined, decision-making slowed, and the weight of cultural and psychological shock lingered. American forces, by contrast, retained full operational capacity, disciplined and alert, having achieved a strategic gain without traditional combat. This pivotal moment, an act of restraint in the midst of battle, crystallized the lesson that would resonate throughout the campaign. Even small gestures, carefully applied, could reshape enemy behavior, influence morale, and create advantages that conventional measures could not achieve. The psychological battlefield, rarely documented with clarity in historical records, had been decisively leveraged in this encounter. The aftermath, with its immediate and enduring consequences, would reveal the true scope of this subtle yet profound turning point. Aftermath, Section 1. In the days following the encounter, the effects of the American strategic restraint became evident across multiple dimensions of the campaign. Japanese units, physically exhausted and psychologically unsettled, reported slower movements and increased caution. Field diaries and post-battle memoirs later noted the confusion that had spread through ranks during the pause. Soldiers recounted hesitation, whispered debates over the Americans' intentions, and the challenge of maintaining cohesion while uncertainty loomed. Even minor delays in march timing had operational consequences, slowing the Japanese advance and creating opportunities for American forces to consolidate positions and reinforce supply lines. From a tactical standpoint, the decision to allow rest demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological leverage in warfare. By permitting the Japanese soldiers brief respite, American commanders reduced the likelihood of immediate skirmishes, preserved their own manpower, and subtly disrupted enemy discipline. Reports from the 32nd Infantry Division describe units observing Japanese formations pause, linger, and adjust, often without firing a single shot. This quiet manipulation of enemy behavior, though small in scale, exemplified a broader operational philosophy that combined human consideration with strategic calculation. The human dimension of the encounter was equally significant. Soldiers who had endured relentless marching through jungle and mud were confronted with a reality that contradicted deeply ingrained assumptions. Japanese troops had been conditioned to expect relentless aggression from the enemy. Encountering care, shade, and sustenance created cognitive dissonance. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate interaction. Men recalled the experience for weeks afterward, recounting the bewilderment of seeing Americans offer rest where previously only attack was anticipated. It became a reference point in discussions of discipline, endurance, and the nature of the adversary. Leadership responses further amplified the aftermath. Japanese officers struggled to interpret these pauses without compromising unit cohesion. Some feared that accepting aid might expose their men to tactical disadvantage. Others recognized that exhaustion was already undermining efficiency. In contrast, American leaders had carefully orchestrated each interaction, balancing vigilance with controlled generosity. This not only protected American forces from surprise engagements, but also allowed observation of enemy reactions. The ability to influence adversary behavior without direct combat became a hallmark of operational acumen in this theater. Logistical superiority was reinforced in these reports. The Americans' capacity to sustain their troops while offering aid revealed a structural advantage that Japanese forces could not match. Water, rations, and shelter were abundant, delivered precisely where needed. Japanese soldiers, reliant on irregular supply lines and foraging, experienced the disparity keenly. The contrast between the two armies' logistical efficiency highlighted the cumulative advantage of American planning, training, and resource management, a force multiplier that extended beyond immediate battlefield outcomes. Cultural contrasts also resonated in the aftermath. The encounter underscored differences in military philosophy. Japanese doctrine emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and immediate engagement, often at the cost of individual welfare. American practices integrated practical concern for human limits into operational strategy. For Japanese soldiers, this divergence was not merely tactical, but moral and psychological, challenging their understanding of warfare and the adversary's ethos. Observers later noted that this episode influenced attitudes towards subsequent encounters, instilling hesitation and an awareness that American forces could exercise restraint while maintaining decisive effectiveness. The cumulative effect of these factors, slowed movement, disrupted cohesion, psychological disorientation, and recognition of logistical superiority, demonstrated the strategic weight of a small, deliberate action. By simply allowing the enemy to rest, Americans achieved a measurable advantage that extended beyond the immediate battlefield. It reinforced the principle that warfare is not solely a contest of firepower, but also of endurance, perception, and adaptability. The scene now sets the stage for broader reflection. How this seemingly minor episode influenced campaign dynamics, shaped operational philosophy, and left lasting impressions on both sides of the conflict. Aftermath, Section 2. In the broader context of a New Guinea campaign, the encounter had implications that extended well beyond the immediate clearing. Japanese units, still shaken by the unexpected American pause, advanced more cautiously in subsequent operations. Reports from field officers indicate that hesitation persisted for days as soldiers anticipated ambushes or traps at every turn. This slowed the tempo of Japanese offensives and allowed American forces to consolidate positions, secure supply lines, and prepare for future engagements with less resistance than might have otherwise been expected. American forces recognized the strategic value of this indirect form of influence. By exercising control through restraint and measured humanitarian gestures, commanders achieved effects comparable to conventional combat outcomes without exposing troops to additional risk. Tactical reports from the 32nd Infantry Division highlighted instances where Japanese units delayed movements or hesitated in attack plans, citing the lingering psychological uncertainty caused by the earlier encounter. Observers noted that even a brief respite, framed within disciplined operational procedures, could alter the rhythm of an enemy advance and create opportunities for exploitation elsewhere. The encounter also left a lasting imprint on Japanese soldiers' perception of the Americans. Memoirs and post-war accounts describe the shock of witnessing an adversary willing to provide rest, food, and care in the midst of a campaign. For many, it was disorienting and counterintuitive, challenging deeply ingrained beliefs about the enemy's ruthlessness. This realization, though subtle, contributed to a broader understanding among Japanese troops that American operations combined efficiency, resource management, and humane treatment, creating a cumulative psychological edge. On the human level, soldiers recounted moments of quiet reflection after the encounter. Men who had endured continuous fatigue noted the contrast between American and Japanese practices, recognizing that discipline and endurance could be complemented by attention to welfare and morale. Officers recorded the incident as an anomaly, yet acknowledged its practical consequences: hesitation, disorganization, and subtle loss of initiative. For the Japanese, what began as a minor tactical pause became a point of cognitive and operational disruption, demonstrating the strategic weight of perception in warfare. From a logistical perspective, the encounter reinforced the advantages inherent in superior planning and supply management. The Americans' ability to maintain operational effectiveness while providing care showcased a level of preparedness that Japanese forces could not match under comparable conditions. Water, rations, and shade were not merely conveniences. They were instruments of control, reinforcing the broader campaign strategy and amplifying psychological influence without direct engagement. The broader military analysis emphasizes that such moments, though small, could shape entire campaigns. By subtly influencing enemy behavior, maintaining readiness, and conserving their own resources, American forces achieved a disproportionate advantage. The episode exemplified a principle that would recur throughout the Pacific theater: strategic patience, careful observation, and judicious use of human and material resources could yield outsized operational results. Ultimately, the aftermath of this encounter highlights the multidimensional nature of warfare. Victory is measured not only in territory captured or enemies killed, but also in morale, cohesion, and the psychological state of the opponent. By allowing Japanese soldiers to rest before resuming their march, Americans demonstrated that operational success often arises from subtle, disciplined actions rather than overt force. The reverberations of this calculated restraint influenced the campaign's rhythm, shaped perceptions of both adversaries, and underscored the importance of human factors in modern warfare. As the campaign pressed forward, these lessons became embedded in operational planning. The impact of a seemingly minor act, offering respite to exhausted enemy troops, would resonate in subsequent operations, affecting decisions, attitudes, and battlefield outcomes. From a moment of shock in the jungle clearing to the larger tactical consequences across New Guinea, the episode illustrates the profound influence of calculated restraint, foresight, and psychological insight in shaping the course of the war. The story now moves toward reflection, the broader meaning of this encounter, its lessons for history, and its enduring resonance in understanding warfare and human behavior. Reflection/closure. The pause in the New Guinea jungle stands as a testament to the complexity of warfare beyond bullets and artillery. In a campaign defined by relentless marches, unforgiving terrain, and unyielding conflict, a simple act of restraint reshaped perceptions, tested assumptions, and influenced outcomes. By allowing Japanese soldiers to rest before resuming their march, American forces demonstrated that operational superiority extends beyond firepower. It encompasses strategy, psychology, and the management of human endurance. This encounter highlights the intersection of culture, leadership, and human resilience. Japanese troops, conditioned to expect unremitting aggression, were confronted with behavior that defied doctrine and challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. Their shock was not born of weakness, but of recognition. The Americans could combine discipline with humane practice, achieving strategic advantage without immediate violence. The episode underscores that understanding an adversary's expectations and deliberately subverting them can be as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. Beyond the tactical and psychological, the episode carries broader historical significance. It illustrates how modern warfare increasingly relies on the integration of logistics, morale, and perception. Superior supply chains, medical support, and disciplined troop management became force multipliers that shaped not just immediate engagements but entire campaigns. The New Guinea encounter, seemingly small in scale, exemplifies these principles, revealing how human factors can amplify operational success. Ultimately, this moment is a study in restraint, foresight, and subtlety. It reminds us that history is often defined by decisions made in the quietest, most understated moments, pauses, gestures, and choices that reverberate far beyond their immediate context. In the jungles of New Guinea, American forces leveraged discipline, empathy, and strategic patience to create a turning point not through the roar of battle, but through the quiet, deliberate assertion of control. In the end, the shock experienced by Japanese soldiers was more than a fleeting surprise. It was a lesson in the profound power of human-centered strategy. It demonstrates that even amidst the chaos of war, understanding, foresight, and respect for human limits can decisively shape the course of history.